Alright guys, my name is MetaGoblin and today we're making a quick discussion video about Classic Plus and what Classic Plus content would actually look like and how likely is it to actually happen. So what I essentially mean by the word Classic Plus, which has basically been a term that's been basically coined by the community, is the idea that there will be content released for Classic WoW when Classic WoW is finished that will not be the Burning Crusade. Like, Classic WoW won't progress into the Burning Crusade, it will progress basically into its entirely own new MMO, in a sense, because then, you know, there will be like totally fresh content with the original Classic WoW game design. So let's talk about what I think this kind of content would actually look like. I've talked about this on my streams previously, and the kind of idea that I came up with is an alternative history. So obviously it wouldn't really make a lot of sense for you to release content for Classic WoW when there already is technically content for Classic WoW. It's called a Burning Crusade, and that's where the story has naturally progressed into. So it wouldn't make a lot of sense in that way. But if you released kind of like an alternative history which is basically the Wall of Draenor expansion, is essentially a alternative history expansion where somebody went back in time, changed things a little bit, and we had to go back in time. I think essentially, I don't really know the full lore about that, but I guess the lore in this sense would be that perhaps the Infinite Dragonflight, again, they mess with time, and you know, the Burning Crusade doesn't happen for some reason, the Dark Portal doesn't exist or is not opened for whatever reasons, and something else happens in the lore of World of Warcraft instead, that, you know, some kind of main antagonist, some kind of main threat to the world that we have to, like, basically go and deal with. And it'd be like an alternative expansion for Classic WoW in an alternative history, an alternative world, and a basically totally alternative story. I mean, you can get very creative with that idea, but at the end of the day, like, at the time of Classic WoW, in the lore and storyline of Classic WoW and the time frame of what it's in, there are a lot of threats to Azeroth and to us as the players and to the main characters of the lore that, you know, they're just hanging about, waiting around in the background. And the only reason why they're not a threat, like, right now is because obviously World of Warcraft has to naturally progress through a certain amount of expansions and a storyline. But at the end of the day, you know, Classic World of Warcraft is set straight after Warcraft Refunded. Warcraft 3. So, you know, Arthas is knocking around. The Lich King is knocking around at the time of Classic WoW. Deathwing, he's knocking around, just having a bit of a snooze. Pandaria does exist in the world right now, and the Mogu exist. The Old Gods exist, all of the Old Gods, Yogg-Saron, even N'Zoth, right, he exists right now. He's just lying around sleeping somewhere. So all these threats do exist in our current state of us playing the game. We're just not dealing with it because that content just hasn't been released basically. But there's a number of routes that Blizzard could take it down, because yeah, there's a lot of lore in World of Warcraft, and they could just change it slightly. An idea that bumped into my head, which is a bit of a stupid one, but you know, basically, obviously Arthas and Illidan have a bit of, you know, a face down. Maybe in this alternative history, the Infinite Dragonflight mess with that, and the Infinite Dragonflight, what we tried to do by altering time is trying to make a lot of the antagonists in the game friends and work together. So maybe in this alternative history, Arthas and Illidan are actually somehow in allegiance with each other, and they could build an expansion around the threat being like the combined threats and storylines of two expansions at once. So you've got Illidan, he's doing his thing, and Arthas is doing his thing. Maybe Arthas and Illidan are both in Northrend, and Northrend is totally different. There isn't just Scourge in Northrend, but there's also loads and loads of Burning Legion and the Scourge, which are basically the same thing, to be honest. If you look at the lore, like, the Scourge was essentially created, I'm pretty sure, by the Burning Legion. But anyway, like, there could be like a new Northrend, or even like maybe like a new zone where both Illidan and Arthas are like plotting together to take over the world and destroy everything with a massive army of demons and Scourge. You know, whatever direction they want to take it in. There's a lot of threats currently in the state of the game, and yeah. Another thing they could do would be on a much smaller scale, and they could work on the content that was originally actually going to be released in Classic WoW and just kind of finish developing it. For instance, Azshara, you probably notice if you ever go to Azshara, it's a very bleak and dry zone. There's not a lot going on in Azshara, and it's because it was originally planned to be basically a battleground area, where a little bit similar to Arathi Highlands, where, well, sorry, like, is it South Shore or... all those zones blend into one for me, but basically very similar to, yeah, Altaric Mountains, kind of Altaric Valley kind of thing. There'd be like a small area, and there was actually going to be basically a full-on battleground released with, you know, I don't know when it was going to be released. I think it's probably going to be released with Battlegrounds, but just never got released. And if you actually go to Azshara right now, you still see evidence of that battleground basically being there. So what they could do is essentially just release a new battleground. Like, you've got to think, once they've released Phase 6, that time frame between Phase 6 and essentially the release of TBC, if that ever does happen, it could be as much as 7 months. Like, Blizzard basically said for retail that the patch 8.3 N'Zoth patch right now is going to last for 7 months before Shadowlands is released. There's always massive content drought at the last patch of every expansion. Apart from Wrath of Lich King, because they actually added an extra raid to keep us interested in the game, which is a good move. But most of the time, there's like, you know, half a year of you playing the exact same patch for ages, which is pretty bad. So what they could do with Classic is, yeah, just add a little few things here and there, like the Azshara raid, maybe finish off maybe release the Karazhan raid early, or Battle for Mount Hyjal. You know, there's a few other things that are in the game currently which are basically totally unfinished content, and there's a lot of evidence around it in the world right now. They could just essentially do that, like release some new dungeons that they didn't finish, or even like a raid that they didn't finish, and stuff like that. The last thing I can really think of is probably quite likely to happen actually, and that would just be random world events, basically leading up to the release of the Burning Crusade. For instance, there's world events like the Scourge Invasion event. They could do something similar to that, or just basically turn it back on again before, the Burning Crusade is released. Or they could have like event world bosses randomly spawned into the world, city invasions. They could do like loads of those like typical server crashing strange events to basically keep things interesting until the Burning Crusade is actually finally released. I mean, obviously there will actually be a pre-patch for the Classic before the Burning Crusade is actually released, and there are actually a number of dungeons and raids that are actually in Azeroth and not in the Burning Crusade. For instance, Karazhan and the Caverns of Time instances. So what they could do, which would be a good move in my eyes, is when they released a pre-patch, they release all the class changes to obviously keep people interested in the game. Maybe release Eye of the Storm Battleground as well, and they could also release like basically maybe Karazhan or the Caverns of Time dungeons, basically scale to level 60. I'm pretty sure that, I think the scale, like the normal versions are pretty much scaled to like level 60 to 65 anyway. I can't remember on top of my head, but I think you go to some Caverns of Time instances like in the mid-level 60s anyway. But no one actually ever did, because people were just leveling in, the TBC, and nobody wanted to go to the Caverns of Time while they were leveling because it was such a trek. So you don't really see people really doing the normal versions of Caverns of Time that much until they're like level 70. So it'd be interesting if they release those dungeons early. Again, just a little bit of content to keep people interested, and at the end of the day, it already is in Azeroth and not in Outland. So something like that would probably make a little bit of, it would basically make more sense rather than them releasing like, dungeons in a different world that they couldn't get to. Another thing that they could do actually is simply release Blood Elf and Night Elf races early and their starting areas. That's another thing that would make a lot of sense to me, because I previously talked about it in my Burning Crusade video, how you kind of divide the player base a little bit, because when the Burning Crusade is released, some people will really want to make Blood Elves, some people will want to make Draenei's, but they'll also want to progress their main character, or they can get, by a race change, which probably won't actually be in a Burning Crusade, on legacy servers anyway. But yeah, like, it would make a lot of sense, because people could, if they wanted to, level up a level 60 Blood Elf or Draenei early before the Burning Crusade is actually released. I think that would be a really good move by Blizzard, because that would definitely keep people very interested in the game, because they'll be like, wow, I can level an alt. But anyway, we're not really talking about Classic Plus anymore. I mean, essentially we kind of are, because we're talking about content that could be released for Classic before the Burning Crusade is officially released, in the way of basically, you know, releasing the Burning Crusade content early. But let's finish talking about how likely Classic Plus actually is. I think all of these ideas that I've just come up with for releasing the Burning Crusade content early, like for instance Blood Elf and Night Elf, and maybe some dungeons early, and obviously the pre-patch and everything like that, those things are pretty likely to happen, to be honest. But new, fresh, innovative, creative content for Classic Plus, I don't think that is as likely. It could be interesting, because what Blizzard could do is take Classic WoW through an alternative history machine, basically, and that would essentially turn Classic WoW... It already is an entirely new MMO, I guess, but it would make it even more a new MMO, because there will be totally new content for the game with the original kind of class mechanics in the game. And I think that could be quite interesting. Like, they could release new content or a new expansion for Classic WoW and tweak the classes slightly to make, you know, Feral Druid, Ret Paladin, all those kind of unviable specs more viable and more powerful. You know, switch things up a bit, make things interesting. But obviously, doing all that would cost a lot of money. We've talked about how Activision Blizzard are a very profit-driven company right now, because they're essentially owned by a publisher that is owned by shareholders who care a lot, basically just about making money. And basically, like, a lot of companies get this wrong, where they think the best way to make money, the best way to make profit is to basically be really, really tight and skimpy with their running costs, their setup costs. And fair enough, that is sometimes true. It is sometimes true that you shouldn't be spending any more money than you really need to, but sometimes if you don't spend enough money investing into your product, you make a bad product, and then people don't buy it. Warcraft 3 Reforged is a classic example of this. They did not spend enough time or money, you know, going into that project to make it a nice, good, polished project that people would genuinely buy and be happy with. Because I think they gave it to basically a different company. It wasn't really even developed by Blizzard. They gave it to a different game developing company from China to basically make a rushed job of it. And it turned out to be terrible, and people are refunding it massively, and it's just obviously not the largest like profit-making game that they've made. And that's been it's been an absolute disaster. Basically, Warcraft 3 has been an absolute disaster. But anyway, I'm properly talking about... No, I'm not talking about Classic Plus anymore. As essentially going into a different discussion now, which maybe I might make a video about this week. I know people probably finished talking about and wanting to hear about Warcraft 3 refunded. But maybe I'll make a video about it, because I do have like a few points I'd like to make about it. I don't think have been essentially made before. Anyway, I think I've rambled on long enough. Thanks for staying by and listening to this kind of podcasty discussion video. My name is Metagoblin. Until my next video, ciao.